It might seem odd that I've elected to place this lecture in the chapter which has mainly been about exploring ethics, but if you think about it, one of many potential sources of conflict in a diverse workplace might be the different cultural, philosophical and ethical influences which work upon the people in that workplace, the people for whom you have responsibility as a manager and a leader. We may all consider ourselves to be both rational and ethical people who adhere to the principles I described in the introductory lecture of this chapter, but research suggests otherwise, and it may be that, as David Arbour, an eminent US psychologist, suggests, we're suffering under the illusion of objectivity, the idea that we're not affected by bias or prejudice, despite it being apparent to us in the actions and words of others. Conflict can come in many forms and have many origins. It is in our nature as humans to associate ourselves through the mechanism of identity. Elements which go into making up this identity might, for example, include our familial or ethnic background, where we live, the culture we were brought up in, and even the lifestyle choices we make. We have control over some of these factors, but others are simply with us from birth and are beyond our ability to control, in most cases, without extreme action. It's these factors, the things which make us different from the next person, and which reflect our true diversity from others much more than visible characteristics, that can be a very positive source of creativity and contribution if valued. But they can also be a source of conflict. Think about your own life. Have you ever considered yourself to be philosophically or actually in opposition to another person or group of people? I know I have. And even if this is just for the duration of a sports match or in response to the introduction of a new piece of legislation, it still represents a potential source of conflict. We're not emotionless robots, and so the ability to be wholly objective is a myth. But striving for objectivity as part of an ethical approach to leadership is perhaps the greatest tool we have in managing and hopefully preventing conflict in the workplace. Objectivity allows us to distance ourselves to a degree from the source of conflict. It requires us to step back and to avoid favouring any one party or group in that developing conflict, and it should allow us to take a perspective which seeks to understand the differing views, cultural contexts, and perhaps ideological standpoints which are the root cause of that same conflict. Objectivity requires us to try and achieve an understanding of multiple perspectives from a non-judgmental standpoint. So here, I suggest the need to inform yourself as widely as possible about those things which are likely to be sources of conflict in the workplace, recognizing that of course conflict may arise without apparent warning, so it's not always possible to arrive as prepared as you might like. So this leads me to my first observation about managing conflict: improving your own understanding of possible sources of conflict. This may, in a global context, for example, mean that you have to educate yourself as to the cultural norms of employees from a background which is considerably different from your own. It's important to recognize that another view or cultural perspective, however alien to your own, is part of the identity of another person, and so valid in their perspective. This is not to say you shouldn't work to support the development of cultural change where appropriate, but starting from a position of I am right and they are wrong means you've already entered the conflict zone and are now part of that clash. Linked to this is acting to prevent a transition from possible sources of conflict to actual conflict. By being aware of potential sources of conflict and acting early, we may be able to nip problems in the bud, as it were. Now, there is no one answer to how to do this, but examples might include encouraging safe spaces to exchange views, education information programs, calling out and challenging toxic behaviour, or working to build better relationships with non-leadership stakeholders such as union representatives. The list is potentially endless. If you're already beyond this point, though, and conflict is occurring, then you may need to intervene more directly. Again, it's impossible to cover all possible scenarios, but you may need to employ a range of actions, which could include simply arranging for two people to talk to each other in a way which encourages mutual respect and understanding, or to the removal of an employee who is a source of toxicity and who is unwilling to countenance any view other than their own. I have personal experience of this latter example, whereby I attempted to manage a conflict between two opposing groups in an organisation over a period of more than 2 years. The issue was between one group of highly experienced individuals who wished to progress to complete more advanced tasks, regardless of those less experienced folks who did not have the skills to keep up, and another group, including some people who were also deeply experienced, which saw the need to slow the pace of work in order to develop the less experienced members of the team. In the end, I had to take direct action, which saw the removal of one particularly experienced individual and a series of discussions which allowed two of their most ardent supporters to reflect on their views and recognise that they needed to consider the needs of others beyond their immediate group. This outcome did lead to a short-term drop in productivity as a result of losing specialist experience and slowed the pace of organisational development. But in the longer term, the organisation was much improved and a much more pleasant place for all to work. So before we move on, let's just summarise what I've said thus far and put it into a simple set of ideas which we can use to guide our actions when it comes to conflict management. Develop your awareness of possible sources of conflict and their origins. Act early to prevent conflict by supporting mutual respect and understanding. When conflict erupts, it's a function of leadership to act, even though this may be tough on you as an individual. And remember, stay as objective as you can be. Okay, let's now move on and look at a simple scenario which explores the management of conflict in a context which also poses some ethical challenges. This exercise is set within the scenario of a survey team deployment to a remote island location in 2014. The island culture is not familiar to all team members, and there are also a number of social and ideological factors at play in the situation as it develops. The survey vessel has been chartered locally, and all the crew members are islanders. To complete the exercise, you need nothing more than a pen, paper, and to keep an eye on your own objectivity. It's a late summer's evening, and everyone is ashore in the local hotel for a meal and drinks in the bar after a hard day's work at sea. You've organised this as a way of building relationships between your survey team and the vessel's crew away from the pressures of work. During the evening, what began as a light-hearted discussion and a bit of banter about the recent referendum on independence for Scotland and the outcome of the general election develops into a physical altercation between a crew member and a survey team member, resulting in both being ejected from the bar. The two miscreants are blaming each other and refusing to sail together. To complicate matters further, the survey team member involved is the lead surveyor. And although you do have the option to replace him, it will mean the rest of the team having to work a heavier shift pattern until the replacement arrives, which will require a delay of at least 5 days to the current plan. Or you can look to manage matters locally with a vessel skipper who, although unhappy with his crew members' behaviour, is insistent that he is required for the safe operation of the vessel. Take a moment to read the exercise detail before you start and consider what ethical challenges you may face as team leader and the senior company representative on the island at this point in time. I would anticipate you having to address a range of leadership issues, including applying some of the ethical concepts we've spoken about to your decision-making. But the ultimate aim of the exercise is to come up with a plan of what to do next, and a plan which both deals with current causes of conflict and mitigates any future ones. Remember, there is no one right answer here, and there are a number of possibilities you could explore. But as you do so, I encourage you to keep in mind the set of ideas I mentioned earlier in the lecture and the ideas of ethical leadership we have discussed so far. Above all, you need to make a decision. You can undertake this exercise as many times as you like, and indeed you may find it useful to do it more than once, but to challenge your previous decision in each subsequent run-through, and so to explore a number of possible outcomes. Please pause the lecture now, and when you're ready, come back so we can draw things to a close. Welcome back. I hope you found that interesting, and that you can see that even with the simplest management of conflict scenario, there are a host of issues you need to address, and a range of possible actions and associated outcomes which could be followed, from dealing with things locally to the removal of the surveyor from the team and the island altogether. I hope you can see that applying either a deontological or teleological approach to the ethical aspects of your leadership decision-making processes will likely result in very different outcomes, and how this exposes the value of exploring more than one school of thought before coming to any decision. Finally, I hope that you did reach a decision, as this is fundamental to leadership, as I've mentioned before, and without it, there can be no resolution to the situation and the issues at the heart of the conflict will remain unaddressed. Whatever you decided, take the opportunity to reflect on this when you have the time. I find that doing this just helps me to be better placed to deal with the next conflict that comes along, which it inevitably will do. Thank you.